When Clarity Thins the World, a Ghosts Movement essay. There is a point that arrives for some people after long periods of self-inquiry, reflection, maturity, or what is often called awakening, where life begins to feel thinner rather than fuller. Not empty, not bleak, not collapsed, but reduced in density. Days continue, relationships continue, work continues, conversations happen, the outer form of life remains intact. Yet the inner pressure that once gave these things weight no longer grips in the same way. This is rarely spoken about directly. Clarity is supposed to liberate. Awareness is meant to deepen experience. Maturity is expected to stabilize purpose. Instead, many people quietly find themselves moving through their lives with less urgency, less appetite, and less emotional heat. Passion no longer pulls in the way it once did. Purpose loosens. Action becomes steady but oddly neutral. It can feel like going through the motions, even when nothing is outwardly wrong. This thinning is often mistaken for apathy, or quietly feared as a kind of emotional failure. People search for explanations. They wonder if something has gone wrong, if they have lost their way, if clarity has somehow backfired. But the experience itself is not chaotic. It is calm, sometimes uncomfortably so. The disturbance comes not from distress, but from the absence of something that once made life feel vivid. To understand what is thinning, it helps to look at what once gave life its thickness. Much of what we experience as meaning is generated through tension. Tension between who we are and who we believe we should be, between where we are and where we imagine we might arrive, between what we have and what we think would complete us. Passion thrives in this space. Purpose feeds on it. Even care and commitment are often charged by a sense of movement towards something that promises confirmation or relief. This tension is not inherently negative. It gives life contour. It creates momentum. It makes choices feel consequential. When you believe you are becoming someone, the world presses back. When you are oriented towards a future that matters deeply, time feels dense. Desire, ambition, love, and even anxiety all borrow energy from this unfinished state. Clarity interferes with this structure. When patterns of striving are seen through, when identity loosens its grip, when the need to resolve oneself diminishes, the machinery that once produced urgency begins to slow. The future loses some of its pull. The self is no longer experienced primarily as a project, and with that shift, much of the intensity that once animated daily life quietly drains away. This is where confusion sets in. People expect clarity to make them feel more alive. Instead, it makes them feel less compelled. They expect maturity to deepen passion. Instead, passion thins. They expect awakening to sharpen purpose. Instead, purpose becomes diffuse. The world does not disappear, but it stops insisting. Tasks that once felt important now feel optional. Conversations that once carried emotional charge now feel informational. Even pleasure changes texture. It still occurs, but it no longer promises anything beyond itself. At this stage, many people continue their lives competently. They go to work, they respond to messages, they maintain relationships, they fulfill responsibilities. From the outside, nothing appears amiss. Internally, however, action has detached from necessity. The body remembers how to move, but the narrative that once framed those movements as essential has thinned. This is often described as going through the motions, but that phrase usually carries judgment, as if something has been lost through disengagement or neglect. In this context, going through the motions is not a failure of care. It is continuity without intoxication. You still act, but the inner story that once made action feel vital has fallen away. This becomes especially visible in ordinary routines. Making coffee in the morning without anticipation, attending meetings without investment, listening to people speak and recognizing the familiar patterns without feeling drawn into them. responding kindly without the emotional reward that once accompanied being needed or appreciated. None of this is hostile or dismissive. It is simply quieter. One of the more unsettling aspects of this thinning is that it can appear alongside increased ethical awareness. People often become more considerate, more patient, more capable of seeing complexity. They may even feel drawn towards helping others, teaching, mentoring, or giving back in some form. On the surface, this looks like purpose re-emerging, yet here, a subtle tension arises. Is this giving back an expression of quiet alignment, or is it a new role stepping in to replace lost momentum? Is it care, or is it continuity wearing the shape of a mission? The difference is not always clear, even to the person involved. A mission needs a story. It needs a sense of progress, impact, or improvement. It needs to believe it is going somewhere. Going through the motions does not. It only needs repetition and coherence. From the outside, both can look identical. From the inside, they feel different, but not always in ways that are easy to name. This raises an uncomfortable question. If clarity leads to a thinning of passion and urgency, what exactly is being offered when one teaches or guides others? Is it insight, or is it an invitation into the same flattening? Is there, hidden inside the language of awakening, an unspoken endpoint that says, this is where it leads? Less hunger, less fire, less illusion. This is not an accusation. It is an observation that carries ethical weight. Some forms of clarity reduce suffering, others reduce intensity. These are not the same thing, and reducing intensity is not universally experienced as a gift. There is also a relational consequence to this thinning. Much of reality feels solid because it is mirrored back to us. We feel alive through resonance, through shared excitement, through emotional feedback loops. When someone no longer needs that mirroring, the echo diminishes, conversations flatten, emotional exchanges lose their dramatic peaks, not because of withdrawal, but because the structures that once amplified feeling are no longer being fed. People around someone in this state may feel less animated without knowing why. They may sense a quiet absence of urgency, a lack of emotional pull. This can be misinterpreted as detachment or superiority, even when it is neither. The person is present, but not magnetized in the same way. This leads to a further unease. That clarity might not only thin one's own experience, but subtly thin the atmosphere around them. That seeing through illusion may also mean seeing through the mechanisms that make life feel gripping, and that sharing this seeing might dampen rather than enliven. At this point, many people turn back, at least partially. They reinvest in ambition, they reclaim projects, they re-engage desire. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not. Not because they believe the old narratives fully, but because the alternative feels too sparse, too quiet, too uninhabited. This is where the phrase, ignorance is bliss, gains its power. Not because ignorance is better, but because it is immersive. It allows the world to feel thick, textured, compelling. It sustains passion by keeping its fuel sources hidden. It lets you be inside the story without watching it unravel. Clarity, by contrast, replaces immersion with awareness, and awareness on its own is not inherently satisfying. It is accurate, honest, stabilizing, but it does not seduce. It does not generate momentum by itself. It removes false reasons faster than it provides real ones. This is the point that is often misunderstood. The thinning that follows clarity is not a destination. It is a consequence, a transitional condition where the old engines have stopped, but no new form of vitality has stabilized. To rush to resolve this state is to misunderstand it. To pathologize it is to misname it. And to romanticize it is equally misleading. There is a temptation, particularly in teaching cultures, to redeem thinning by making it useful, to turn insight into service, transform awareness into productivity, to justify clarity by converting it into impact. But not all knowledge wants to be applied. Not all seeing wants to be shared. Some truths flatten more than they heal. This does not make them wrong. It makes them honest. The deeper lesson here is not about how to recover passion, but about recognizing what kind of passion has been lost. Passion that depends on hunger cannot survive the removal of hunger. Purpose that relies on tension cannot survive the release of tension. Meaning that is generated through becoming dissolves when becoming is no longer believed in the same way. We are rarely taught how meaning exists without urgency. We know how to burn, we know how to strive, we know how to want. But we have little language for quiet alignment, for action without intoxication, for care that does not promise fulfillment. This is why finning feels so disorienting. It exposes a cultural gap, a lack of models for living without narrative pressure, for continuing without the promise of arrival. Some people will decide that this is not enough, that they prefer the thickness of illusion to the thinness of clarity, that they would rather live inside compelling stories than stand outside them in quiet awareness. This is not a failure. It is a choice, one that deserves respect rather than correction. The real danger lies in pretending that clarity automatically leads to vitality, compassion, or purpose, in selling awareness without naming its cost, in turning finning into a doctrine or an endpoint. Perhaps the most honest stance is restraint, to acknowledge what clarity removes as well as what it reveals, to admit that some forms of awakening do not make life better, only truer, and to resist the urge to make that truth palatable. The finning of reality is not something to overcome. It is something to be understood without urgency, not as a flaw, but as a consequence of seeing too clearly for certain illusions to survive. That may not be bliss, but it may be the price of honesty.